I'm not going to do a long rambling spiel because we're going to dive straight into it. I think many of you are familiar with Cormac Smith. He's going to introduce himself very briefly, and then we're going to dive into the topic of the day. This is, and let's be frank, this is the abusive approach of the White House to try to coerce Ukraine into capitulating to an agreement that is very much not in its favor. And it seems this is being done not only because there's a sense of desperation and urgency in the White House. It's being done because America and Donald Trump within this agreement will profit from such an abusive and coercive process. Is this the parting of the ways between the Western allies and the US, between the democracies of the world and the authoritarians, of which the US appears now to have become one? Um, let's do a quick introduction and then we'll dive into the topic. Cormac.
Jonathan, lovely to see you. As always, Cormac Smith, nearly 40 years of my career in public relations and political communications, I suppose most significantly for this, for 2 years between 2016 and 2018. As a British diplomat, I was embedded in Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs as, to give me my full title at the time, the Strategic Communication Advisor to the Foreign Minister of Ukraine, who was Pavlo Klimkin at the time. Many Ukrainian friends, and I do stuff like this with Jonathan because we really need to try and get the message out and inform people as to what is really going on and the threat, not just to Ukraine and why Ukraine matters to us, but the threat to all of us.
And this has been going for some time. We've been warning really since, well, even during Biden's term, that NATO had become something of a zombie institution, and there was the risk of it becoming essentially a sort of a facade to cover up the hollowness and lack of sort of purposeful decision making and strategy vis-a-vis not just Ukraine, but wider European security. But we've been having this flip-flopping where Trump has actually been rather effective at shifting between hard appeasement of Russia and softer appeasement of Russia. At times, he's been able to communicate or give the impression that he's aligned with a rules-based order. I say impression because the hard evidence is far less for that. And if you wanted to look for it, the evidence wasn't there. But this has been quite an effective, it seems to me, behavioral operation to try to convince the Allies not to abandon the US sooner. But are we now at that break point?
Jonathan, we absolutely are. And, I don't think Donald Trump has actually flip-flopped. I think it has been very deliberate. And if one could read the mind of Donald Trump, I think we would see that his objectives and his malign intent has not changed one iota. I said on television nearly 2 years ago, and I was challenged. Trump was in Putin's pocket. This was before he was re-elected. I was challenged by the interviewer. I was challenged by a gentleman called Greg Swenson, who's the chair of Republicans Abroad. I had no hesitation in saying, no, I absolutely stand by my words. Yes, the time has finally come. This is the US is no longer the leader of the free world. When they return, we do not know. We certainly cannot wait for that. This is now a point for our leaders in Europe to move away from the fine words and the shoulder to shoulder, and as long as it takes, and the condemnations, not just in Europe, but our friends in Canada and South Korea and Japan and Australia and New Zealand. There may be one or two others, but what I would call, the free world, the democracies, because Trump is clearly leaving us behind. And this is not, as I have been trying to say for 4 years, this is not just an existential threat to Ukraine. And I have said earlier this week that Ukraine cannot and will not accept this capitulation proposal, which I have said looks like it was drafted in the Kremlin and is being translated into English by the White House. Not only can Ukraine not accept this because it will mean the end of Ukraine, this is now an existential threat to Europe and to the rest of us in the democratic world. And the time for fine words is over.
And of course, we've talked a number of times, and with the unique Mr. John Sweeney as well, about the idea of compromat. I think at this point, though, and I'm going to put this sort of to you, that it's not a helpful concept because to think that Trump is doing these heinous things, to think that he is engaging in what is, frankly, abusive behavior. And actually, we saw it in the Oval Office, and now this is just an intensification of what we already knew was there. To call that compromise, to say he's doing it because he's under some kind of external pressure, is almost, it feels like a cop out at this point. Because it seems to me that the abusive behavior is the very core of who he is. That aligning with autocrats and aspiring to be an autocrat is who he is. Profiting off the misery, destruction, and death of noble peoples and personally benefiting from it, this is who he is. So is it time now to really dig in and see who is Donald Trump and do we want to have any relationship with that entity whatsoever? Because if we do, that taint, that corruption threatens to envelop all of us.
Jonathan, I agree with you completely. And there may or may not be compromat, and we can go around in circles, and we all know what we think that compromat may be. What is far more important is two things are very, very clear, Jonathan. One, Donald Trump is in thrall with what he perceives as strongman dictators in general, and with Vladimir Putin in particular. The second point that I would make, and I have no compunction and I have no hesitation in saying this, Donald Trump is, in my view, without doubt, the most corrupt, the most venal president in the history of the United States. Now, this proposal, I've already said, would mean the end of Ukraine. It's also an existential threat for Europe. But I was listening to a former US ambassador, I think it was to the OECD last night, reiterating the fact that this is seeing that Ukraine wins and Russia is defeated in Ukraine is in America's interest. I think if we look at what Donald Trump is doing and the absolute size of the corruption in his White House team and how he's enriching himself and his family since he came to power for the second time, it is very, very clear that Donald Trump cares not for the United States. Donald Trump cares for Donald Trump. He sits with the corrupt autocrats of the world. We're on our own when it comes to the United States. It is time, the saying goes, to wake up and smell the coffee.
And it's an interesting interview that happened very early on in the war, actually, that suggested that Zelensky has, one of the better biographies of Churchill by his bedside and dips into it for, I guess, inspiration and strength. It's, we have to have some sympathy for the man. It cannot be easy. And his speech yesterday seemed to have, again, echoes of that sort of Churchillian address. And one of the quotes I'm going to have here is that what Churchill said, and this is really, in riposte to Chamberlain and others and their previous policies, nations that went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished. And this seems to be translated into, Zelensky terms in his speech yesterday. But he is, as we've come to get used to it, he said exactly what is going on, and he has placed immediately the stark choice in front of his people. We face cold, we face lack of electricity, we face hardship, we face death, and we fight, or we kowtow to the 28-point plan, which really is it's a laundry list of the Kremlin's demands with a few things sort of thrown in. It's quite clearly compiled by a real estate guy trying to put together a dodgy deal on the back of a napkin. That's kind of what it feels like, loosely translated from Russian, which I know you've been saying on some of your interviews. But I'm interested in this Zelensky. Will he reach for his inner Chamberlain? Will he reach for his inner Churchill at this moment? And will he be able to take Western democracies with him?
I hope. My optimistic feeling at the moment is he will reach for his inner Churchill. You know, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was about to come up with that exact same quote. A nation that goes down, a nation that capitulates is finished. A nation that goes down fighting will rise again. And, you know, so far, I think in his speech yesterday to the Ukrainian people, Zelensky has been saying the right things. He is saying that this is quite possibly the most difficult point in Ukraine's history. They face a horrible choice between a one-time ally. Do they abandon that ally or their dignity and their freedom? This is about much more than this is about much more than dignity. I mean, this needs to be spelled out. The acceptance of this capitulation plan will be the end of Ukraine. We know what Putin wants. As a good friend of mine said, he wants Ukraine without Ukrainians. And he is willing to do anything to achieve that. He does not believe Ukraine is a real country. So, you know, I optimistically believe that we will see the inner Churchill come out in Zelensky, but in a way, you know, that's not as important as we might think. What's important is the Ukrainian people, and Ukraine is, at the end of the day, a democracy. And it is I have talked many times, and you're aware of it too, of the incredible will and resilience and bravery of the Ukrainian people. And like you, Jonathan, I have many Ukrainian friends, and I speak to Ukrainian friends from senior diplomats and government people to people in civil society. Nobody I'm speaking to at the moment is showing the slightest inkling of surrender, and Ukrainians, as you know, are exhausted. There's certainly nobody I know in Ukraine hasn't lost somebody, but they know that this is existential for their country. Let's remember, because we know people forget. Let's just take a moment to remind people of Mariupol in the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. The Nazis during the Second World War, in 2 years, murdered 20,000 civilians in Mariupol in 2 years. The most conservative estimate of the number of civilians murdered by Russia in 7 weeks is 25,000. The estimates go up to 100,000. A city of nearly 500,000 people, the size of Edinburgh, wiped off the face of the map. And you know, in fact, we both know Sean Pinner, who has become a friend of mine throughout this, and I speak to Sean on a regular basis. And Sean is one of the people that really keeps me in touch with what's going on. Sean, for anybody who doesn't know, is a former British soldier who took Ukrainian citizenship, joined the Ukraine Marines, and fought to his last bullet in the defense of Mariupol, which was his home. Then got his wife to safety. He was captured. He was tortured for 9 months. He was sentenced to death. He fortunately got out on a prisoner swap and is now, you know, an activist and one of the loudest voices fighting for Ukraine. So we've got to remember this. People throw the word genocide around. I was using the word genocide from the very beginning. I was predicting it would be genocidal. And in fact, you can listen to me or you can listen to Professor Timothy Snyder out of Yale University. What Russia has done in Ukraine for 4 years easily is all five tests of the UN Convention on Genocide. The key about genocide is intent. Putin and his cronies have told us very, very clearly they intend for Ukraine. They do not believe it exists. It should exist. They want it back. They want it back for its riches, and they want it back because there's no greater threat to the corrupt, kleptocratic regime in the Kremlin than a democratic, thriving, successful Ukraine on their doorstep. That's why the successful Maidan revolution in 2013, 2014 was the straw that broke the camel's back, which was followed by the illegal annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass.
And it seems from people who have much closer connections to politicians than I do that it's generally understood the toxicity of Russia, the threat from Russia is generally understood across Europe. I mean, that means that someone like Orban and Fico, understand the threat and choose to ally with that threat, to become minions of that evil to save themselves. I think that's clearly what's happened there. But if Western politicians in France, in Germany, in Britain understand the scale of the threat to Ukraine and to themselves and yet fail to act, I find that more terrible, that abnegation of responsibility in the full knowledge of what could happen, in the full knowledge that we are, as we've been saying for some time, on the brink of World War III. And Ukrainians have been saying that this is what this will lead to unless you push back against Russia's evil early on. And we didn't, and we haven't, and we never have actually supplied what is required to do that. And of course, we've held on and on to the point where we've thinned Ukraine out. We've brought it to the point of I would say it's a mixture of strength and fragility, as is Russia as well. But we have never hardened them and armed them to the point where they could make it clear to Putin that he'll never win. This is our failing. It is not Ukraine's failing. But our politicians being in the knowledge of all these things and yet still not acting. And that includes on the other topic we're going to bring up, which is the 140 billion of frozen Russian assets. We have the tools. We have the tools, even without calling on our taxpayers, to significantly fortify Ukraine. Could we dive into that? That absolutely, let's call it out for what it is, cowardly and myopic approach to this crisis, which, unless we fix that, is going to be terminal for the European project and NATO potentially as well.
Jonathan, let me say three things broadly. First, you just mentioned World War III. Um, this, the acceptance of this capitulation plan, which I have been saying for 2 days, Ukraine can and will not accept, would mean three things. It would mean the end of Ukraine. It would mean the end, effectively, of our rules-based order, because the one tenant of that order is a large neighbor can't simply invade, destroy, plunder, pillage, and rape a weaker neighbor and take what they want. So if the former leader of the free world is seen to reward Russia for doing that, which is what this capitulation plan would do, that is effectively the end of a rules-based order that has pertained for 80 years, and it will be left to us in Europe and a few other allies to rebuild it. But the third thing, you talked about World War III. I believe, and it was interesting listening to Timothy Snyder, if this were to go through, it would send shivers down the spines of many smaller nations who would look to gain nuclear weapons as the only viable defense that they would have against a larger avaricious neighbor. This would drive nuclear proliferation and would therefore bring the world closer to World War III. The second point I want to make is you talked about Fico and Orban, and we're talking about the absolute supine cowardness for 4 years, I would call it, of our leaders. When the EU does not have the ability to kick members out, it does have something called Article 7, and Article 7 can suspend the voting rights of members. When is the EU going to grow a spine and apply Article 7 to both Orban and Fico? And yes, the third point is the 140 billion, which must be unleashed. But I just go back to something that I've been saying from the very start, actually before the 24th of February 2022. We need to arm Ukraine to the teeth and sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. After 4 years, we haven't done that properly. Let's not just focus on Trump, because it said that Joe Biden looked at what Ukraine needed, gave them half, gave it to them slowly, and gave it to them with handcuffs on, in collusion with Jake Sullivan. So, there's been a great fear of beating Russia because of what maybe Russia would revert to using its nukes, or maybe the breakup of the Russian Federation would be worse than what we face now. No, it wouldn't. The Russian Federation, I would suggest, is going to break up sooner or later. All we can do in the West is prepare for that breakup.
And
Yeah,
like
finally.
Germany initiating the First World War, it didn't just take its own institutions down. It took down European monarchy. It took down the entire architecture of Europe, and then obviously inevitably well, inevitably, but it led to the Second World War, which then physically erased old Europe and its cities. So collapsing empires, collapsing social orders, it can be a terrible thing. Now, people will find it odd if I suggest that the winding down of the British Empire was perhaps the least chaotic and bloody in human history. That doesn't mean it wasn't chaotic and bloody. It led to millions of deaths, quite literally, and it led to several intractable conflicts that are the direct result of that entity, as well as resentments and so on. But as it goes, as imperial collapses go, it was by no means the worst or the most consequential. Russia is not going to go down, and I've been saying this for some time. Russia is not going to go down without taking a lot of people and stuff with it, unfortunately, because that's, I think, the nature of that entity. That, however, is, if we say that Western politicians are starting to realize the toxicity of Russia, I think they still don't understand the long historical process that's going on here. Whereas Ukrainians will say there will not be peace in Europe, not, wait until Putin goes. They say as long as Russia remains an imperial entity, there will not be peace and security in Europe. This is a delusion which is still, I think, very firmly embedded in the minds of our Western politicians.
Yeah, Russia as it exists, and Russia in its history has never really had a tradition of thirsting after freedom and democracy. They have thirsted after strongman dictators or czars, and that is what they have got. We know that the thing that Putin fears most is the Russian people, because they will put up with all sorts of deprivations. It's said over 50% of Russian households don't even have a inside flush toilet. We know that inflation is rampant. We know that living standards are falling. We know that there's all sorts of hardships in Russia at the moment. Putin simply cannot afford to be seen to lose the war, because at that stage maybe he drinks some tea laced with polonium, or he falls out a window, or whatever is going to happen. And this is not beyond the realms of reality or possibility. So, as I said before, and I quote Ben Hodges, actually, former General Ben Hodges of America, former Supreme Commander of American Ground Forces in Europe, who is one of the military men that you and I would follow very closely. Ben said about a year ago, he said, we can't prevent the inevitable actual breakup of the Russian Federation. All we can do is use all of our institutions and all of our power and all of our capability to prepare for it, manage that as well as possible, and make sure that it impacts as little on us as possible. But it's going to be messy and it's going to be costly. But I repeat, Jonathan, you know me as a lifelong communicator. I love me sound bites. And this really is, if I haven't already said it in this interview, our money and guns today, and the Ukrainians will still do it for us, or it's our daughters and sons tomorrow. And, time to get the heads out of the sand. And going back to where I started, is this the point where our supine leaders finally get the message and finally move beyond fine words of shoulder to shoulder, and as long as it takes, well, two tests. I'll give you three tests off the top of my head, right? One, the 140 billion euros before Christmas, please. That will be a very nice Christmas present to the brave Ukrainians. Secondly, Article 7, please. And let's neuter Fico and Orban. And the third point, we're hearing all about German remilitarization and how Germany has turned the corner. And Friedrich Merz said about this time last year that if he was elected chancellor, that he would give Putin 24 hours to cease fighting and start withdrawing, or he would flood Ukraine with tourists. I was in the office of the of Ukraine's ambassador to Berlin two years ago now it was, and on his mood board behind his desk, the central word was Taurus. Well, Ukraine still has not been given Taurus, and for those listening in that don't know, Taurus is a cruise missile. It's very, very similar to Storm Shadow, which was the very first Western cruise missile that Ukraine was given by the Brits, and also Scalp, which is the French version of Storm Shadow. Taurus is similar. The only difference with Taurus is Taurus has about twice the range of what Western weapons they currently have. We do know that Ukraine has recently developed its own cruise missile with a warhead twice the weight of Taurus or Storm Shadow or Scalp, and a range of 10 times, 3,000 kilometers. It's not as stealthy and it's not as accurate. So they still need these Western sophisticated cruise missiles systems to continue what has been a very, very effective campaign to target Russia's oil and refining industry. This is really putting a squeeze on Russia, and we said after the First World War, it's making the pips squeak.
Yes. And they've been doing it with US intelligence data. Now, I don't know, because I'm not a technical analyst here, whether Taurus is dependent on US intelligence or whether there are European sources or British sources of satellite intelligence that Taurus can work off. But this is the other coercive pressure that the US is now threatening. It's threatening over the counter very blatantly to withdraw intelligence. It's done it before. So for those like Michael McFaul that's saying, where's this? Why is this happening? Why is this suddenly happening? Well, this isn't sudden. This is snapping back to a default behavior, a default appeasement and alignment with authoritarians. But this is the other issue for Europeans, of course, which is the loss of US intelligence data that's threatened. Below the counter, there are some rumors leaking out of supposed Finnish diplomats that the US is also threatening to remove its forces and protection from Europe. So this seems to be quite likely. As part of this abusive behavior, we will see certain actions which make not just Ukraine more vulnerable, but all of Europe more vulnerable.
Two days ago now, when this first started to break, I had a discussion with my closest friend in Kyiv, and we both predicted that the main pressure point Trump would apply would be the removal of military intelligence, which they have done before, you will remember, for a period of 2 weeks, and it was extremely costly to the Ukrainians. Trump has since come out and indicated that this indeed will be one of the consequences of Ukraine not signing up to this capitulation deal. Well, look, my friend, former Colonel Philip Ingram, who was a colonel in British military intelligence. Myself and Philip do a lot of stuff together. We also drink pints together and have some great conversations. And Philip has made very, very clear to me that we can and we are replacing what America has done in terms of hardware. The Ukrainians themselves, don't forget, are now producing over 60% of their own frontline weaponry. And also they have made great strides in producing their own long-range drones and cruise missiles. The one thing Philip is telling me that we cannot quite replace at the moment is the military intelligence of the US. So Trump knows this. This will be, as I say, we predicted it with a friend 2 days ago, and it has come to pass. This is the greatest pressure point. Zelensky knows this, which is why he said this is possibly the most difficult juncture his country has come to. We absolutely must stand by Ukraine and do everything well, I gave you my first three on the wish list, which was Article 7, the 140 billion euros, and maybe Taurus would be a nice Christmas present, but there's a lot more that we can do. We're all in for a tough time here. This is not going to be easy. But do you know what? If our leaders And also, if our people, because we're democracies and ultimately our leaders depend on our people, if we as people and if our leaders could show 1/10 of the testicular endowment of the Ukrainians, yeah, we can, you know, we can solve this. Just 1/10 of the courage and the resilience, that great country and its great people, how they have suffered. And, you speak to Ukrainians. I don't speak to one single Ukrainian that is not as resolute as they were in the early days of this, because we know that if Russia stops fighting, there will be no war.
This
And
is it.
if
I went,
Ukraine stops
yeah,
fighting, there will be no Ukraine.
this is it. I went to, I mean, this really came home to me. We were walking from an event to the pub with a couple of Ukrainians who've known each other and known each other's families for a long time. And in this short, sort of 10-minute walk, they managed to exchange prodigious amounts of information about who was dead, who was missing, who was captured, and other stories of relatives from occupied territories, of fear, of torture, of the privations and repression and capriciousness that is experienced there. In this short 10-minute walk, the intensity of suffering and tears and laughter and information. And then I got to the pub and talked about, what we had to talk about, which was related to the war, but other things. And that moved me very deeply because they are containing so much and yet carry on and fighting in a way that is almost inconceivable to most people in the West. And this is the very last question here, because this is what worries me most. There are still issues within Ukrainian society. There are still issues within the political system which have burst out into the open. There are still issues with the, let's say, remnants of a Soviet mindset, which unfortunately have led to inefficiency and needless casualties on parts of the battlefield. There are regiments that are really pulling ahead and they're going to try and take the rest of the army with them, but there are still significant pockets, unfortunately, of Soviet thinking, very hierarchical thinking, which is profligate with life. That's just a fact, and that puts off a lot of people from joining the army, which is another problem. But in our supine state that you've described, we risk pushing Ukraine to a point where, one, it has to make almost impossible choices. If Zelensky were to make the wrong choice at this point, it seems to me that we risk pushing Ukraine into a place where the resilience, cohesion start to come apart at the seams, fall apart, because, as you say, the order might be given, for instance, this is highly theoretical, I don't think it'll happen, but let's say the order from Kyiv was given to hand over part of the Donbass as part of a deal. If we actually tried to force Ukraine to do this, or someone in Ukraine was minded to force the deal, I unfortunately think that there would be people on the ground, troops on the ground, who would say, no. You would have an internal revolt at that point. I don't think that's the way Zelensky's going to go, because, as we say, he's going to channel his inner Churchill. He understands that pivot point he's in, but it is our fault, not theirs, because of their corruption scandals and so on. That stuff they have to deal with. We have our own scandals and corruption on a scale that, unfortunately, we barely admit to ourselves. No, we have forced them into this position of having to make impossible choices. We have forced them to the edge of their strength in terms of defense. That's more of a rant there, but I don't know if you've got anything to add to that thought.
Look, the 2 years I spent in Ukraine, my job was very clearly to help drive the reform agenda, because that was a pot of money that I was paid out of. And to the point, my ambassador, who was my boss, knew what I was doing in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but being me, I put myself about a bit and networked a lot, and I ended up working with 5 other ministries, including 3 other cabinet ministers. Anything from I'm helping them run communications programs to media training ministers and so forth. And I would obviously I would always clear what I was doing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And given that I was doing it outside, normally I would do it outside office hours, or I would do it on the weekend. That was fine, and I was working with friends of the minister. But I also, of course, had to clear with my boss, the British ambassador. And I was always asked the exact same question: Cormac, can you demonstrate that what you will be doing with Tim Bush, the deputy PM for European integration at the time, or the minister for health, or whoever I was working with, can you demonstrate that what you're doing drives the reform agenda? So that was one of the things I was focused on. And, I coined a phrase at the time, very, very early on, which I got in the mouths of many, including the president, the prime minister, and the foreign minister, that in 2016, Ukraine had made more progress in fighting corruption and in reforming since the Maidan revolution than it had done in all the years back to independence in 1991. And that was true, and we could demonstrate that. We could demonstrate that with a world first called Prozoro, which was a digital system for government buying, which cut out the ability for brown envelopes. With the reform of the police in various cities, we had examples of this. Now, since I left Ukraine, Ukraine has continued to reform. And the biggest piece of evidence with this was I think it was last year, when the European Union agreed the next step on Ukraine's accession journey to full membership of the European Union. And that was down to Ukraine being able to demonstrate that they were indeed making steady and meaningful progress on reform and fighting corruption. But do you know, Jonathan, here's the thing, and you alluded to it. We in the West always hold Ukraine to much higher standards than we hold ourselves. We've just had the release of the COVID report, the endemic corruption of the last government at a time when tens of thousands of British people were dying. What the government was doing and the money that was being wasted on PPP, etc., etc. Look at the rampant corruption in the United States at the moment, and the degree to which the Trump family has been enriched since 47 came to the White House for the second. Yes, Ukraine has, and we're seeing it recently, still has problems with corruption. This is partly due to the legacy of the Soviet Union, and it's partly due to links which unfortunately still exist between the Kremlin mafia and parts of Ukrainian society. I used to say when I was in Ukraine that Ukraine fights a war on two fronts, and this was back in 1618, because this war started in 14. They fight a war externally against Russia, but they also fight a war internally against those who would plunder and pillage and rape their own people. So this is a war that Ukraine has been fighting. It's very, very unfortunate what has come out recently. I think we look to Zelensky to take some very, very firm action against people who have up to recently been very, very close friends and allies of his. I think this is absolutely fundamentally important. But my point is, you can look at Ireland, you can look at the United Kingdom, you can look at the United States, you can look at any Western country. Yeah, we're just better at hiding our sins. And we hold Ukraine to a much higher standard than we hold ourselves. So I think, yes, we want to see Ukraine deal with the corruption, but this feeds into the Russian narrative. Is there no corruption in Russia? Russia is infinitely more corrupt than Ukraine is, but Russia is not a democracy. If there were protests in Russia, such as there were against the Zelensky administration by students a number of months ago, against Zelensky taking control of certain anti-corruption bodies, those people would be beaten off the streets and locked up. There is a difference. So yes, there is corruption problems in Ukraine. There's corruption problems in all our country. Ukraine has continued to fight and to make progress in reforms and against corruption, even in the teeth of this genocidal war for the last nearly 4 years. So let's get things in a bit of perspective. And ultimately, Yes, I hope Zelensky does channel his inner Churchill. I hope Zelensky does do the right thing. I hope Zelensky continues to be an effective leader of his people. But if he doesn't, Ukraine is about more than one man. It's about the Ukrainian people. And as you just told about your 10-minute walk to the pub, you and I have Ukrainians who will be friends for life. We have a wide range of Ukrainians who we speak to on a daily basis. They have a resilience and a toughness about them that we simply don't have. And that didn't come out of the last 4 years. That came out of the last 100 years or more of the horrible way the horrible way they've been treated. My education started when I went to Ukraine and I started staying up, sometimes in the office, sometimes in the pub or the restaurant. I started staying up till 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, talking to people about what it was like to grow up in the Soviet Union. I started getting family stories about people that went to the Gulag and came back broken people after 20 years, and family members who went to the Gulag and never came back. And they have grown up with this. I didn't even know about the Holodomor till I went to Ukraine. A good degree in politics and economics and student of history all my life. Yeah, the Holodomor in 32, 33, where Stalin effectively murdered between 4 and 7 million Ukrainians in a genocidal man-made famine. The purpose was to put the boot on the neck of Ukraine, followed by a purge of the intelligentsia, where I believe up to 500,000 were wiped out. It was the Second World War. It was in the Second World War. It wasn't Russia. It wasn't China, or sorry, not China, Japan. It wasn't Russia or Japan who lost the greatest proportion of its population, the greatest number of people. It was Ukraine. That horrible war on the Eastern Front. It was Ukrainians who suffered the deprivations, not just of the Nazis, but of the Bolsheviks as well. These people have. We do not know we are born in the West. These people have grown up tough and hard and resilient. How is it, as you know, that they still manage to be among the warmest, most decent, welcoming people that I have certainly ever come across? I've been to, I don't know, 60, 100 countries in my time on this planet. No country, no country I've ever visited has had the effect on me that Ukraine had in a very, very short period of time. I went for a great professional experience. I got so many more gifts from Ukraine, including many dear friends for life. Mm, and but it also taught me about there's more, there's more, there's more to Ukraine than just Ukraine. Ukraine matters not just Ukraine; it matters to all of us. Jonathan, let me tell this story because it's a little bit of my anger is near the surface at the moment. Back in 2016, one of the first big projects I did was to get, I think it was 13 or 14 of Europe's top ambassadors recalled to Kyiv for a week. And then we got a few senior diplomats from the ministry to join us. And I brought a colleague of mine who's one of the top media trainers in the UK over, who had done a lot of work with the Foreign Office. Together, we did some intensive work with the ambassadors on media training, how to handle difficult interviews, but also on message discipline. As I said, look, you've got to start telling the same story in Berlin and Rome and Paris and so forth. And I was taken aside, a senior British diplomat, not my ambassador Judith Gough, I will put on record, who never gave me anything, who never suggested anything like this. And Judith was my boss, and Judith was my North Star, and I came out of Ukraine with nothing but the most massive respect for Judith. But a senior British diplomat took me aside and he said, "You know what, Cormac? Ukrainians are very fond of saying they're fighting for Europe. This doesn't go down very well in European capitals. Maybe you should try and tell them this." And somehow, as a first-time diplomat, I found the confidence not to follow that guidance. It's an instruction. The only person who could have given me an instruction was Judith Gough. I certainly never got that instruction from here. 2 years later, just before I left Ukraine, I was at a meeting of Friends of Ukraine in Vilnius in Lithuania, and this was a pretty high level group had been set up after the Maidan to work with Ukraine to combat Russian disinformation. I had been working for over 6 months on a campaign that I thought would be very successful, and I think the headline or the strapline of the campaign was "Russia lies on an industrial scale." Because as you and I know, Jonathan, rebutting and fact checking doesn't work when you're dealing with disinformation. You've got to educate people about the source, make people understand, and actually all the information is out there. And in that meeting, I'd done everything possible. I was leading on this campaign and I'd made my pitch and I'd even specifically asked for Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Linus Linkevičius was the man at the time, great big man who was a great friend of both Klimkin, my minister, and Ukraine. And I specifically requested that Linus attend, and he did, and he made a great intervention and presentation in support of what we were proposing. And it was kiboshed from my memory by the Germans and the French, who said with some venom that we could not use such language, Russia lies on an industrial scale. We could not use such language about the Russians. It would annoy them, and we needed to keep speaking to them. And I was about to, in my anger, I was about to say something, and my very good friend, a senior Ukrainian diplomat sitting beside me at the table, squeezed my leg under the table and leaned in and whispered in my ear, "Leave it, man," because there was no point. Two little stories that tell you how far have we actually moved from that disgusting, treacherous, supine position. Pray God we have, because we are drinking in the last chance saloon. It
And
really is our money and guns today, or it will be our daughters and sons tomorrow, Jonathan. Have no doubt.
and if the events and actions of the last couple of days don't bring that home, I fear nothing will. Cormac, this story is going to run. We are going to be running episodes to make sure we cover it and bring the hard truths to the audience, which I know they appreciate because there's an extraordinary amount of not just disinformation, but I would say normalization, even amongst experts, looking at this and saying things like, well, this deal seems to be fair, and really not realizing what it is. It's a vehicle, it's a tool to divide and distract and destroy the resilience and unity of the Western world. It is not a peace deal. And this annoys me beyond reckoning that the use of the word peace, 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 peace. No one is thinking about Putin and how he acts and how he uses these processes to divide, conquer, and continue the aggression. For there, we'll have to end this one, but we're going to pick these themes up with other speakers over the next few days, and I'd be delighted to have you back on to inject some fire and realism into this conversation. Cormac, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everything you do, your tireless efforts in the support of Ukraine.
Jonathan, it's always a pleasure to join you, but it's more than a pleasure. It's really worthwhile. And the thanks goes right back at you, sir, because I know how much you put on the line. This is not just a way to make a living. You do this from the heart. And so, I consider you a brother.
We're in this together, and I'm very grateful to you for that and to everybody else. Thank you.